10. Efrain Saldivar, the Angel of Death. In the late 1990s, a disturbing mystery emerged from a hospital in Glendale, California. At the center of it was Efrain Saldivar, a respiratory therapist who had worked at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. To patients and their families, he was supposed to be someone helping people breathe during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Instead, investigators would eventually accuse him of deliberately causing the deaths of hospital patients. What made the case particularly disturbing was that, at first, there was almost no obvious trail pointing toward murder. The patients were already seriously ill. Many were elderly, and when someone dies inside a hospital, there can be an understandable assumption that the illness itself was responsible. But then rumors began circulating among hospital workers about Saldivar and what one colleague reportedly called his magic syringe. That suspicion eventually reached hospital officials. In early 1998, Glendale Adventist reported information about a respiratory therapist who might have deliberately caused a patient's death. Police began investigating, and then Saldivar himself walked into the Glendale Police Department. What happened next would transform the investigation. According to investigators, Saldivar told police that he had caused the deaths of numerous patients. His initial confession was extraordinary. He claimed that he had deliberately killed as many as 50 terminally ill patients beginning years earlier. He described himself as an angel of death, suggesting that he had targeted patients whom he believed were already close to dying. But there was a major problem. Investigators did not immediately have enough independent evidence to prove that the killings had actually occurred. Saldivar was arrested, but he was released after only 2 days. Then he changed his story. Saldivar publicly claimed that he had lied. He said he had been deeply depressed and had fabricated the confession because he wanted to die and hoped that authorities would ultimately give him the death penalty. For investigators, this created an enormous challenge. Was Saldivar a killer who had suddenly decided to deny everything? Or had police encountered a deeply troubled man who had invented an unbelievable story? There was only one way to find out. Investigators began examining the hospital's records, and the scale of the investigation became enormous. Police had to examine deaths involving patients who had been under Saldivar's care or whose deaths occurred during his shifts. Thousands of medical records were reviewed, while investigators interviewed former co-workers and examined circumstances surrounding individual deaths. Eventually, investigators selected 20 patients' cases for further examination. Their bodies were exhumed. This was the moment the case began to change. Laboratory testing conducted at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory found evidence of the paralyzing drug Pavulon in tissue samples from 6 of those patients. That discovery provided investigators with something Saldivar's original confession had not: physical evidence connecting the deaths to an unauthorized drug. The 6 patients whose deaths became the foundation of the criminal case had died between December 1996 and August 1997. Among them were Salbia Satrian, Eleonora Schlegel, Jose Alfaro, Luina Shidlowski, Balbino Castro, and Myrtle Brower. Investigators also identified another patient who survived an incident in which Saldivar was accused of administering the drug. Her name was Jean Coyle. Coyle had been receiving treatment at Glendale Adventist when she suddenly experienced a severe medical emergency. She survived, and her account became an important part of the investigation. After nearly 3 years of investigation, Saldivar was arrested again. This time, the case was very different. It was January 9, 2001. Saldivar was driving to work when police arrested him. He was charged with 6 counts of murder. The prosecution argued that he had deliberately caused the deaths of 6 patients while working as a respiratory therapist. The case also contained an extraordinary twist. After his second arrest, investigators obtained another confession. This time, according to records later made public, Saldivar allegedly claimed that the number of victims was far higher than the 6 murders for which he would eventually be prosecuted. He reportedly told investigators that he had killed many more patients than originally admitted and claimed that the killings had continued for years. However, those broader allegations were never established as convictions. That distinction is extremely important. Saldivar was convicted only for the 6 murders to which he ultimately pleaded guilty, plus the attempted murder of Jean Coyle. The much larger numbers contained in his confessions remained allegations rather than proven convictions. And that brings us to one of the most controversial parts of the case. Prosecutors initially faced the possibility of seeking the death penalty. Saldivar had been charged under circumstances that could potentially make him eligible for capital punishment. But eventually, prosecutors and the defense reached a plea agreement. On March 12, 2002, Saldivar pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. The sentence was severe: 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional sentence for the attempted murder. Saldivar would spend the rest of his life in prison. At his sentencing, the surviving victim, Jean Coyle, spoke about what had happened to her. She was one of the people who could personally describe surviving an incident that investigators believed was connected to Saldivar. The case left many questions that could never be completely answered. How many victims were there? Was Saldivar telling the truth when he claimed dozens of additional killings? Or had some of his statements been exaggerated or fabricated? Investigators had examined hundreds and eventually thousands of medical records, but only 6 deaths produced the evidence necessary for the murder charges that resulted in his conviction. That is why the case of Efren Saldivar remains so unsettling. It wasn't simply the story of a healthcare worker accused of killing patients. It was also a story about how difficult it can be to identify wrongdoing when the victims are already seriously ill, when death can initially appear natural, and when the person suspected of causing it works inside the very institution where those deaths occur. Saldivar's own words first opened the investigation. His later denials complicated it, and scientific evidence ultimately helped investigators build a case strong enough to bring him back into custody. But the question of whether his claimed victim count was ever close to the truth remains one of the darkest unanswered aspects of the story. Today, the 6 murder convictions, not the much larger numbers contained in his confessions, are the established legal record. And that makes Efren Saldivar a fitting starting point for our countdown of California's deadliest serial killers. But number 9 takes us into an entirely different kind of nightmare. One involving a predator who operated in Southern California and remained unidentified for years. 9. Cary Stayner, the Yosemite Killer. In the summer of 1999, the peaceful surroundings of Yosemite National Park became the setting for a series of murders that shocked California. At the center of the case was Cary Stayner, a 37-year-old handyman who lived and worked near Yosemite. Stayner did not initially appear to be the kind of person anyone would associate with a multiple murder case. He had worked around the Cedar Lodge area, a small community near the park, and was known to people who lived and worked there. But in February 1999, something happened that would later become an important part of his story. A woman named Joie Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist working in Yosemite, disappeared. Her disappearance immediately alarmed people in the area. Armstrong had been working at Yosemite National Park and was living in the park. When she failed to appear for work, concerns quickly grew. Her body was eventually discovered near the park. The investigation became a major law enforcement operation, but investigators initially did not know who was responsible. Months passed. Then, in July 1999, another series of disappearances began. 3 women, Carol Sund, her teenage daughter Julie, and their friend Silvina Peloso, had traveled to the Yosemite area as tourists. They were staying at Cedar Lodge, but they never returned home. Their vehicle was eventually discovered, and investigators began searching for the missing women. The case quickly attracted national attention. 3 people had disappeared while visiting one of America's most famous national parks. Investigators worked to reconstruct their movements and determine what had happened. The investigation eventually focused on a man who had worked at Cedar Lodge. His name was Cary Stayner, and what investigators uncovered would reveal that the Yosemite disappearances were connected to something much darker. Stayner was arrested in July 1999. According to prosecutors, he eventually admitted responsibility for the murders. Investigators connected him to the deaths of 4 women: Joie Armstrong, Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. The prosecution's case also revealed that Stainer had a complicated personal history. Years earlier, when Stainer was a child, his younger brother Stephen Stainer had been abducted. Stephen disappeared in 1972 when he was only 7 years old. He remained missing for more than 7 years before eventually escaping his captor and returning home in 1980. The story became national news. But Carey was the older brother, and the experience reportedly had a profound effect on the family. During Carey Stainer's later trial, his defense attorneys argued that his troubled psychological history played an important role in what happened. The prosecution, however, portrayed him as responsible for his actions. The legal battle centered partly around whether Stainer should be held fully responsible for the murders. The evidence against him was substantial. Stainer had been arrested after investigators discovered connections between him and the victims. He ultimately admitted killing the 4 women. The case moved rapidly through the courts. In 2002, Stainer was tried in federal court in connection with the murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. Federal prosecutors sought the death penalty. The prosecution argued that the murders were deliberate and that Stainer deserved the maximum punishment. His defense presented evidence concerning his psychological condition and personal history, but the jury ultimately found him guilty. Stainer was sentenced to death for the 3 federal murders. The 4th victim, Joie Armstrong, was killed in California, and Stainer was separately prosecuted in state court. He pleaded guilty to her murder and received another life sentence. The case therefore ended with Stainer facing both a federal death sentence and a state life sentence. For the families of the victims, however, the convictions could never undo what had happened. The murders had destroyed 4 families and transformed a place associated with nature and tourism into the scene of one of California's most notorious criminal investigations. The case also raised difficult questions about whether Stainer's childhood experiences had influenced the person he eventually became. His brother Stephen's kidnapping had made the Stainer family nationally known years before Carey committed his crimes. But experiencing trauma does not automatically explain or excuse criminal behavior. The Yosemite murders therefore remain a complicated case involving personal history, psychological questions, opportunity, and individual responsibility. Stainer's case also demonstrated how quickly an investigation can change once authorities discover that seemingly separate crimes may be connected. The murder of Joie Armstrong had initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy. Then, 3 tourists disappeared. Eventually, investigators realized that the crimes were connected to the same individual. Carey Stainer was convicted of killing 4 women. His crimes ended in 1999, but their impact continued for decades. The case remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of crime around Yosemite National Park. And unlike some unidentified killers, there was no mystery about who committed these murders. The evidence led investigators directly to Carey Stainer, and the courts ultimately held him responsible. Today, he remains incarcerated under his federal death sentence. As investigators continued examining California's most notorious murder cases, another case would emerge involving multiple victims, a much larger confirmed death toll, and a killer whose crimes would eventually become one of the state's most disturbing criminal investigations. 8. Wayne Adam Ford, the trucker serial killer. In the late 1990s, a long-haul truck driver was traveling across California, moving from one city to another as part of his job. His name was Wayne Adam Ford. To people who knew him, Ford could appear ordinary. He had served in the U.S. Marine Corps and later worked as a truck driver. But behind that ordinary appearance was a series of murders that would eventually stretch across several California counties. Between 1997 and 1998, 4 women were killed. The victims were Tina Renee Gibbs, Lynette Dayon White, Patricia Ann Temez, and an unidentified woman who became known as Humboldt County Jane Doe. Investigators eventually connected all 4 deaths to Ford. The first known victim was an unidentified woman whose remains were discovered in Humboldt County in 1997. Because investigators could not immediately determine who she was, the case remained particularly difficult. Then, in 1998, More women were found dead in different parts of California. One victim was Tina Gibbs, a 26-year-old woman from Las Vegas. Another was Lynette White, 25, whose body was discovered in San Joaquin County. The fourth known victim was Patricia Tamez, 29, from Hesperia. The fact that the victims were discovered in different counties initially made the investigation more complicated. But there was a connection. Ford's work as a long-haul trucker gave him the ability to travel extensively throughout California. Investigators eventually determined that he had encountered the women during his travels. Then, on November 3, 1998, Ford did something extraordinary. He walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department with his brother. Ford told authorities that he had killed 4 women. He was surrendering himself. His confession immediately transformed the investigation. But what made his surrender particularly shocking was that he arrived carrying a piece of one of the victims' remains. Authorities were confronted with a suspect who was not simply being accused of murder. He was walking into the police station and confessing. Ford told investigators that the killings had been accidental. He claimed that the women had died during encounters with him and maintained that he had not deliberately intended to kill them. But investigators did not accept that explanation. They believed the evidence showed something much more deliberate. The prosecution would later argue that Ford had deliberately targeted vulnerable women and that the killings were motivated by his desire for sexual gratification. The investigation continued for years. DNA evidence was eventually used to connect Ford to some of the murders. The 4 cases occurred in different counties, but prosecutors were able to bring them together under California's serial murder laws. Ford's defense presented a very different picture. His attorneys argued that he suffered from serious psychological problems. They also pointed to a brain injury Ford said he had suffered in an earlier automobile accident. Ford himself suggested that the injury had affected his behavior and mental state. Another important part of the defense was Ford's decision to surrender. His brother had encouraged him to turn himself in. Ford's attorneys argued that this demonstrated remorse and showed that he wanted the killings to stop. The prosecution, however, maintained that turning himself in did not erase responsibility for 4 murders. After years of legal proceedings, Ford finally went on trial in San Bernardino County. The trial began in 2006. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Ford to the 4 victims and argued that the murders were first-degree killings. The defense continued to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of Ford's mental state. After deliberating, the jury reached its decision. On June 27, 2006, Wayne Adam Ford was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. But the case wasn't over. The jury then had to decide Ford's punishment. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense asked the jury to consider a sentence of life imprisonment instead. The fact that Ford had voluntarily surrendered became one of the central arguments for mercy. His brother testified about the events leading to the surrender and described Ford's emotional state before he walked into the sheriff's station. Ultimately, the jury recommended death. Ford was sentenced to death in California. His case remains one of the state's notable serial murder prosecutions because the investigation began with the suspect himself walking into a police station and confessing. But there was another disturbing question surrounding the case. Ford was suspected of potentially being responsible for other crimes beyond the 4 murders for which he was convicted. Those suspicions were never established as additional murder convictions, and that distinction matters. The confirmed legal record is 4 murder convictions. The broader allegations remain separate from what the courts actually proved. Ford's case also demonstrated how difficult serial murder investigations can become when victims are found in different locations and when a suspect moves extensively across a large state. California's size allowed Ford to travel hundreds of miles between locations, while the victims' cases initially belonged to different jurisdictions. Only after investigators connected the evidence did the larger pattern become clear. A truck driver traveling through California had encountered multiple women, 4 of whom would ultimately be identified as his murder victims. His decision to surrender ended the killings and gave investigators the opportunity to reconstruct what had happened. But it also left investigators with a disturbing possibility. there may have been more victims than those for which Ford was ultimately convicted. Wayne Adam Ford remains one of the killers on California's death row, and his case remains a chilling example of how a seemingly ordinary occupation can provide opportunities for a serial offender to move repeatedly between communities. 4 women lost their lives. 4 families were left searching for answers. And one of California's most disturbing serial murder cases finally reached the courtroom years after the first victim disappeared. As the countdown continues, the next case takes us to Los Angeles, where a killer operated for years while a growing number of victims disappeared from the same city. 7. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. For more than 2 decades, a serial killer operated in South Los Angeles while managing to avoid arrest. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., but investigators would eventually give him a chilling nickname, the Grim Sleeper. The murders connected to Franklin occurred between 1985 and 2007. He was ultimately convicted of killing 10 people, 9 women and a teenage girl, and attempting to murder another woman. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Jackson, whose body was discovered in South Los Angeles in 1985. Over the following years, more women were found dead. Investigators began noticing similarities between several of the cases, raising the possibility that a single offender was responsible. But identifying that offender proved extremely difficult. The murders were taking place in an area already struggling with violent crime, and many of the victims were vulnerable women. Investigators had limited evidence and no obvious suspect. Then the killings appeared to stop. For years, there were no confirmed murders that could be conclusively connected to the same offender. But in 2002, another woman was murdered. 5 years later, in 2007, Genesia Peters, a 25-year-old woman, was killed. Investigators began looking again at the old cases. The apparent gap between the earlier murders and the later killings helped produce the nickname Grim Sleeper. But the biggest breakthrough would come from an unexpected source. DNA. California investigators began using familial DNA searching, a technique that could identify possible relatives of an unknown suspect by examining DNA profiles in law enforcement databases. The technique eventually produced a lead. Investigators discovered a possible familial connection to the DNA evidence from the murders. The connection led them toward a man whose son had entered the DNA system. That man was Lonnie Franklin Jr. Police began watching Franklin. Eventually, investigators obtained a DNA sample from him and compared it with evidence from the murder cases. The result was a major breakthrough. The DNA connected Franklin to the crimes. On July 7, 2010, police arrested him. After nearly 25 years, investigators finally had their suspect. But the investigation became even more disturbing when police searched Franklin's home. Among the evidence discovered was a large collection of photographs showing women. Investigators eventually released 180 photographs publicly, hoping members of the public could identify the women. Authorities did not claim that every person in the photographs was a victim, but the discovery raised an important question. How many victims were there really? Franklin was eventually charged with 10 murders and 1 attempted murder. But investigators believed the actual number could potentially be higher. Detectives reportedly suspected that Franklin may have been responsible for additional killings, although those suspected cases did not result in murder convictions against him. That distinction is important. The established legal record is 10 murder convictions and 1 attempted murder conviction. The larger numbers discussed by investigators remain allegations rather than proven convictions. Franklin's trial finally began in 2016. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence and other evidence connecting him to the victims. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case and questioned the interpretation of some of the forensic evidence. But after the lengthy trial, the jury reached its verdict. On May 5, 2016, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder. He was also convicted of attempting to murder Enietra Washington, a woman who survived an attack connected to the case. The case then moved into the penalty phase. Prosecutors argued that the scale and circumstances of the crimes justified the death penalty. Victims' families addressed the court and described the devastating impact the murders had on their lives. The jury ultimately recommended death. In August 2016, Franklin was formally sentenced to death for the 10 murders. The conviction finally brought an end to a criminal investigation that had lasted for decades. But the case left behind a disturbing question that may never receive a definitive answer. Were there more victims? Investigators had reason to suspect there could have been. The photographs found in Franklin's possession suggested that investigators might not have uncovered the entire story. But without sufficient evidence connecting additional deaths to Franklin, those cases could not simply be added to his confirmed victim count. And that is one of the most important lessons from the Grim Sleeper investigation. A serial killer can leave behind evidence that investigators may not fully understand for years. Technology eventually changed the case. A familial DNA search provided investigators with a potential connection. That connection led them to Franklin. And forensic testing ultimately helped establish the evidence necessary to bring him to trial. For the victims' families, the arrest came after decades of uncertainty. Some had waited years to know who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Others had spent years wondering whether the killer would ever be identified. Franklin had lived in Los Angeles for decades and had worked as a garbage collector. He had also worked as a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department. To people around him, he could appear ordinary. That contrast made the case even more disturbing. The man investigators had spent decades searching for had been living within the same community where many of the murders occurred. Eventually, science caught up with him. 10 murders were proven in court. 1 woman survived, and the possibility of additional victims remained one of the darkest unanswered questions surrounding the case. The Grim Sleeper investigation became one of the most significant serial killer cases in Los Angeles history, and a powerful example of how modern forensic technology can breathe new life into investigations that have remained unsolved for decades. And as we move further down this list, the next case takes us to a killer whose crimes became synonymous with fear across California, leaving investigators with one of the most infamous and unidentified murder cases in American history. 6. The Zodiac Killer, California's most infamous mystery. Few names in American criminal history have become as synonymous with mystery as the Zodiac Killer. Unlike many serial killers on this list, the Zodiac was never definitively identified. He operated in Northern California during the late 1960s, targeting people in several communities and sending cryptic letters to newspapers that turned the investigation into a national obsession. The first confirmed attacks attributed to the Zodiac occurred in December 1968, near Benicia, California. 2 teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were attacked while sitting in a parked car. Both were killed. The case initially appeared to be a terrible but isolated crime. Then, several months later, another attack occurred. On July 4, 1969, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were attacked while sitting in a car in Vallejo. Ferrin died. Mageau survived. The surviving victim provided investigators with a description of the attacker, giving police one of their first significant leads. But the case soon became much larger. Shortly after the July attack, newspapers began receiving letters from someone claiming responsibility for the killings. The writer called himself the Zodiac. The letters contained details about the crimes that appeared to demonstrate that the writer knew information that had not been publicly released. Then came the most extraordinary part. The Zodiac began sending cryptograms to newspapers. One of the most famous was a 408 symbol cipher sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. A married couple, Donald and Betty Hardin, eventually solved the cipher. The message contained disturbing claims about the killer's motives, but it did not reveal his identity. The Zodiac continued writing, and he appeared to enjoy the attention. He demanded that newspapers publish his letters and threatened further violence if they did not. The case became a media sensation. People across Northern California began wondering whether the person living next door, or someone they passed on the street, could be the Zodiac. Then came another confirmed attack. On September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked at Lake Berryessa. Hartnell survived. Shepard later died from her injuries. The survivor provided investigators with information about the attacker. A few weeks later, another murder occurred. On October 11, 1969, a San Francisco taxi driver named Paul Stine was shot and killed. This case was particularly important because witnesses saw the suspect leaving the area. Police received a description of the man, but despite the information available to investigators, the Zodiac was never definitively identified. The killer continued sending letters. In one of them, he claimed responsibility for additional murders. But investigators could not independently verify every killing claimed by the writer. This created an important distinction. Authorities officially attribute 5 murders and 2 attempted murders to the Zodiac. The killer himself claimed a much higher number. That means the larger victim count, sometimes associated with the Zodiac, remains unconfirmed. The case eventually became one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries. Years passed. Decades passed. Investigators changed. Technology improved, but the Zodiac's identity remained unknown. Then, in 2020, something extraordinary happened. A team of amateur codebreakers successfully solved the famous 340-character Zodiac cipher, known as the Z340. The FBI confirmed that the cipher had been solved. But there was a major disappointment. The decoded message did not reveal the Zodiac's identity. Instead, it contained more of the killer's bizarre and boastful writing. The mystery remained. Over the years, numerous people have been publicly identified as possible Zodiac suspects. Some theories have received enormous attention, but none has been conclusively established as the Zodiac Killer. That uncertainty is what separates this case from almost every other case in our countdown. With most serial killers, investigators eventually identify the offender. With the Zodiac, the question remains open. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why did he stop? And did he actually kill more people than the 5 officially confirmed victims? Those questions have generated decades of books, documentaries, investigations, amateur theories, and forensic research. The Zodiac case also demonstrated something unusual about serial killers. The killer did not simply commit crimes and disappear. He deliberately communicated with the public. He turned the investigation itself into part of the story. His letters created fear far beyond the locations where the murders occurred. Every new message generated headlines. Every possible suspect generated speculation. And every unsolved clue kept the mystery alive. More than half a century later, the Zodiac Killer remains unidentified. The 5 confirmed murders are among the most notorious unsolved crimes in California history. And despite advances in DNA analysis, forensic science, cryptography, and investigative technology, no definitive answer has emerged. The Zodiac case is therefore not simply a story about murder. It is a story about an investigation that has outlived generations of detectives. A killer who wanted to be remembered succeeded, but perhaps not in the way he intended. He became one of the most famous unidentified criminals in American history. And somewhere in the next stage of our countdown lies another California killer whose confirmed victim count would dwarf the Zodiac's and whose crimes would eventually become one of the state's most shocking serial murder cases. 5. Chester Turner, the South Los Angeles serial killer. In Los Angeles, California, a series of murders remained unsolved for years. Women were disappearing. Their bodies were being discovered in different parts of South Los Angeles. And investigators struggled to determine whether the cases were connected. The killer responsible would eventually be identified as Chester Dwayne Turner. Turner's crimes took place during the 1980s and 1990s, and investigators eventually connected him to 10 murders. But what made his case especially disturbing was how long it took for investigators to connect him to the killings. Turner's known victims were primarily women who were living in difficult circumstances. The first murder eventually attributed to Turner occurred in 1987, when Regina Washington, a 21-year-old woman, was killed. At the time, investigators did not know that her death would become the beginning of a much larger investigation. More victims followed. Among them were Margie Rogers, Mary Edwards, Paula Vance, Deborah Williams, Mary Bennett, Mildred Birch, Brenda Breeze, Dominique Lewis, and another unidentified victim. For years, the murders remained separate investigations. Los Angeles was dealing with a large number of violent crimes, and investigators had limited forensic technology compared with what exists today. Then came the development that changed everything: DNA testing. As forensic science improved, investigators began re-examining evidence from older, unsolved cases. One of those cases involved Regina Washington. Investigators eventually obtained a DNA profile from evidence connected to her murder. The profile was compared with databases containing DNA from convicted offenders. A match eventually emerged. The name attached to that match was Chester Turner. Turner was already serving a prison sentence for another crime. That meant investigators suddenly had access to a suspect who could be tested against evidence from multiple unsolved murders. The results were significant. DNA evidence connected Turner to several of the killings. Investigators began reconstructing his movements and examining additional cases. What had once appeared to be a collection of unrelated murders was now becoming a serial killer investigation. Turner was eventually charged with multiple murders. Prosecutors argued that he had deliberately targeted women in South Los Angeles and that the evidence showed a clear connection between him and the killings. The case went to trial. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence. DNA evidence was particularly important because it connected Turner to victims whose murders had remained unsolved for years. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence, but the DNA links became a central part of the case. In 2007, Turner was convicted of killing multiple women. He received the death penalty. But the investigation did not end there. As detectives continued reviewing old cases, additional murders were connected to Turner. Eventually, he was convicted of 10 murders. That made him one of the most prolific serial killers ever convicted in Los Angeles. But Turner's case also demonstrated how easily an offender can disappear into a city's larger crime statistics. The victims were not all killed at the same time. Their bodies were discovered in different places, and the cases were investigated separately. Without modern DNA technology, the connection might have remained hidden much longer. The investigation also showed why preserving evidence from old cases can be so important. Years after a murder occurs, technology that did not exist or was not advanced enough at the time can potentially provide the breakthrough investigators need. For Turner's victims, that evidence eventually helped establish a connection between their deaths and the same offender. The case also raised questions about whether Turner could have been responsible for additional murders. Investigators examined other unsolved killings in Los Angeles, but not every suspected case resulted in a conviction. As with many serial killer investigations, there is an important difference between suspected victims and proven victims. The confirmed legal record establishes Turner as responsible for 10 murders. Other theories and suspicions should not automatically be treated as fact. Turner's crimes left a lasting impact on the victims' families and on the Los Angeles community. For years, some families had no idea who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Then forensic science provided answers. The killer had not been identified through a dramatic confession. He had not walked into a police station. Instead, investigators followed the evidence. A biological trace left behind years earlier eventually pointed toward a man who was already behind bars. And once that connection was discovered, investigators were able to reopen cases that had seemed almost impossible to solve. Chester Turner was ultimately sentenced to death in California. His case became another example of how DNA technology transformed serial killer investigations. But it also revealed something darker. A killer could operate for years, moving through a large city while individual murders appeared unrelated. Only when investigators connected the evidence did the larger pattern become visible. 10 murders were ultimately established in court. 10 families were left dealing with the consequences. And a series of cases that had once seemed unrelated became one of Los Angeles's most significant serial murder investigations. The deeper we go into California's history of serial murder, the larger and more disturbing the cases become. And the next killer on our list would become one of the most infamous predators in California history, one whose name became permanently associated with terror across the state. 4. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. In the summer of 1984, fear began spreading across California. People were waking up to reports of violent attacks occurring in homes across the Los Angeles area. There appeared to be no obvious pattern. The victims were different ages. They lived in different neighborhoods, and the attacks seemed to happen without warning. The person responsible would eventually become known as Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, but eventually moved to California. By the early 1980s, he had developed a criminal history involving drug use and theft. Then, in 1984, his crimes escalated dramatically. His first known murder occurred in Los Angeles County. The victim was Jenny Vincow, an elderly woman who was found dead in her apartment in June 1984. At the time, investigators did not know that her death would later be connected to one of California's most notorious serial killers. Months later, another series of attacks began. In March 1985, Ramirez attacked several people in the Los Angeles area. The crimes created an atmosphere of fear because there appeared to be no clear way for residents to predict who might be targeted. The attacker entered homes, often at night. He stole property and attacked people inside. The crimes varied significantly, making the investigation particularly difficult. Some victims survived and were able to provide descriptions. Others did not. Investigators began gathering evidence from different crime scenes and looking for connections. Then Ramirez made a mistake. Evidence recovered from one of the crime scenes eventually produced a fingerprint. The print was entered into law enforcement databases. Investigators received a match. The suspect was Richard Ramirez. Now authorities had a name. They also had a photograph. Police released his photograph to the public. What happened next was extraordinary. Ramirez had become one of California's most wanted men. His face appeared on television and in newspapers throughout the state. People recognized him, but Ramirez was still free. He attempted to escape the area, eventually traveling south toward Los Angeles. When he arrived there, people began recognizing his photograph. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles. He tried to escape, but several members of the public recognized him and began pursuing him. Ramirez ran through the neighborhood, attempting to get away. Eventually, members of the community caught up with him and restrained him until police arrived. The man who had terrified California was finally in custody. His trial became one of the most heavily publicized criminal proceedings in California during the late 1980s. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Ramirez to numerous attacks and murders. The case involved multiple jurisdictions and a large number of victims. The prosecution also presented forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence connecting Ramirez to the crimes. Ramirez maintained his innocence during parts of the legal proceedings and became known for his unusual courtroom behavior. The trial lasted months. In 1989, the jury reached its verdict. Ramirez was found guilty of 13 murders, along with numerous other crimes including attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The jury then recommended the death penalty. The judge formally sentenced Ramirez to death, but the case did not end there. Ramirez remained on California's death row for more than 2 decades. His appeals continued through the courts. Meanwhile, the Night Stalker case remained one of the most notorious serial killer investigations in American history. Then, in 2013, Ramirez's story came to an end. He died in prison at the age of 53 while awaiting execution. His death was caused by complications from B-cell lymphoma. By the time he died, Ramirez had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. His crimes had permanently changed the way many Californians viewed nighttime security. But the case also demonstrated the importance of forensic evidence. A single fingerprint helped investigators identify a man who had been terrorizing communities across California. Without that evidence, the investigation might have continued much longer. Ramirez's confirmed crimes included murders and numerous other violent offenses. The number of attacks associated with him was much larger than the 13 murder convictions. But once again, it is important to distinguish between crimes established in court and broader claims or suspicions. The 13 murder convictions are the established legal record. Richard Ramirez remains one of the most recognizable serial killers in California history. His nickname, the Night Stalker, became permanently associated with the fear that spread through Southern California during 1984 and 1985. His arrest brought an end to the immediate threat. His conviction brought legal accountability. But for the families of his victims, the consequences lasted far beyond the courtroom. The Night Stalker case became a landmark investigation in California criminal history, and a reminder that even an offender who appears impossible to identify can eventually leave behind the evidence investigators need. And as our countdown approaches the top 3, the next case involves a killer whose crimes were far less publicized at first, but whose eventual victim count would make him one of California's most prolific convicted serial killers. 3. Juan Corona, the farm worker killer. In the spring of 1971, something horrifying was discovered in California's agricultural heartland. Farm workers in Sutter County were disappearing. At first, there was no obvious connection between the missing men. They were migrant workers who moved through California's farming communities looking for employment, but then investigators began finding graves, one after another. The discoveries would eventually reveal one of the largest serial murder investigations in California history. The man at the center of the investigation was Juan Corona, a labor contractor who helped recruit farm workers. Corona was born in Mexico in 1934 and later moved to the United States. By the early 1970s, he was living in California and operating as a labor contractor. He helped provide workers to farms in the region. That position gave him something investigators would later consider extremely important: access to vulnerable farm workers. In February 1971, one of the workers Corona had recruited disappeared. Then another disappeared. Then another. But because many migrant workers traveled from place to place, their disappearances did not immediately produce the kind of alarm that might have surrounded missing members of permanent local communities. Everything changed in May 1971. A farmer discovered a grave on property near Yuba City. Authorities were called. Investigators began examining the area. Then they discovered another grave, and another. The number of bodies continued to grow. Investigators soon realized they were not dealing with a single murder. They were uncovering what appeared to be a mass burial site. The search expanded across several properties. Eventually, authorities discovered 25 bodies. All of the victims were men. Most were farm workers, and many had been working in the same agricultural region. The scale of the discovery shocked California. Investigators now had to determine who could have had access to so many victims. Their investigation led them toward Juan Corona. Corona knew many of the victims. He had helped employ farm workers. He knew where they worked. And investigators discovered evidence linking him to the killings. Police searched Corona's property and found documents and other evidence that prosecutors would later use against him. One particularly important piece of evidence was a machete that investigators believed had been used in the murders. Corona was arrested. The case quickly became one of the biggest murder prosecutions California had ever seen. But Corona denied being responsible. He maintained that he had been framed. The defense argued that the evidence against him was not sufficient to prove that he had personally committed the murders. The prosecution presented a different picture. They argued that Corona had systematically killed the farm workers and buried them on properties where he had access. The trial began in 1973. It was an enormous case. Prosecutors had to establish that Corona was responsible for 25 separate murders. The sheer number of victims made the trial unusual. Witnesses testified about Corona and his relationships with the farm workers. Investigators presented physical evidence recovered during the investigation. The prosecution also relied on records showing connections between Corona and several victims. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Corona was found guilty of 25 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 25 consecutive life terms. At the time, the case was considered one of the largest serial murder prosecutions in American history, but Corona's legal battle was far from over. His attorneys appealed the convictions. The case eventually returned to court, and in 1978, Corona was granted a new trial because of legal issues surrounding his original conviction. The second trial took place in 1982. Once again, prosecutors presented evidence linking Corona to the killings. And once again, the jury found him guilty. He was again sentenced to 25 consecutive life sentences. Corona spent the rest of his life in prison. He died in 2019 at the age of 85. But even decades later, the case continued to generate questions. Why did the killings happen? Why were the victims targeted? And how had someone been able to kill so many people without being stopped earlier? The victims' status as migrant farm workers was an important part of the story. Many lived transient lives and had limited connections to the communities where they worked. Their disappearances could therefore be overlooked more easily than those of people with large families and established local networks. That vulnerability became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The investigation also demonstrated how important physical evidence can become when investigators discover a large number of victims. The graves themselves provided investigators with the evidence necessary to establish that the disappearances were connected. Instead of investigating one missing person at a time, authorities suddenly had a mass murder investigation on their hands. And at the center of it was a man who had been connected to many of the victims through their work. Juan Corona was ultimately convicted of 25 murders. That makes him one of the most prolific serial killers ever convicted in California. But there is another important distinction. Although Corona was convicted of 25 murders, investigators have not established a significantly higher victim count comparable to some other notorious serial killers. The 25 convictions remain the central, established figure in the case. For the families of the victims, however, the number was never simply a statistic. Each of those 25 men had a life, a family, and a reason for coming to California. They had traveled there looking for work. Instead, they became victims of one of the state's most notorious murder cases. Juan Corona's case remains a chilling chapter in California criminal history because of the sheer number of confirmed victims and the way the murders remained hidden until investigators discovered the graves. The investigation turned a series of missing person cases into a shocking revelation. 25 farm workers had been murdered. And as we move closer to the final two cases in this countdown, the number of confirmed victims will once again become only part of the mystery. 2. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. For decades, one of California's most notorious serial killers remained unidentified. He was known by several names over the years, including the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer. His crimes stretched across California and lasted for more than a decade. But despite the enormous investigation that followed, authorities could not identify him for decades. The man behind the crimes was Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was born in 1945 and eventually became a police officer. That detail would later make his story even more disturbing, because while investigators were searching for a dangerous predator, DeAngelo was working within law enforcement. His criminal activity began in the 1970s. Between 1976 and 1979, a series of sexual assaults occurred in Sacramento County. The offender targeted women in their homes and appeared to carefully study the neighborhoods where he operated. Investigators eventually gave him the name East Area Rapist. The attacks continued, and as police began connecting cases, the investigation grew. The offender eventually moved beyond Sacramento. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, similar crimes were being reported in other parts of California. The killer had changed his territory. He had also escalated to murder. In Southern California, a series of murders became connected to the same offender. The cases were eventually attributed to the man investigators called the original Night Stalker. For years, investigators did not know that the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker were the same person. Then forensic evidence connected the cases. DNA testing eventually established that the crimes were committed by one offender. But there was still one major problem. Investigators had the DNA. They had crime scenes. They had victim accounts. They had decades of investigative work. But they did not have a name. The Golden State Killer became one of America's most notorious identified criminals. Years passed. Then decades passed. The case was never forgotten. Investigators continued preserving evidence and searching for new leads. Eventually, forensic genealogy changed everything. In 2018, investigators uploaded crime scene DNA information to a public genealogy database. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators searched for relatives who might share portions of his genetic profile. That approach produced potential family connections. Investigators constructed a family tree and eventually narrowed their attention to a particular man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo had been a police officer in California. He had served with the Exeter Police Department and later the Auburn Police Department. He had also lived in communities connected geographically to the crimes. But investigators still needed direct evidence. Police began secretly collecting DNA evidence from objects associated with DeAngelo. Testing eventually provided the confirmation they needed. The genetic profile matched crime scene evidence. After more than 4 decades, investigators finally had their suspect. DeAngelo was arrested in April 2018. He was 72 years old. The arrest shocked many people because the man investigators had been searching for was not a fugitive living under an assumed identity. He had been living in California for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in American criminal history. Prosecutors charged DeAngelo with numerous murders and other crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the case never went through a traditional murder trial. In June 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous other offenses. As part of the agreement, he admitted to committing crimes against numerous additional victims. His plea spared the victims' families from having to endure a lengthy trial. In August 2020, DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing proceedings, victims and their families were given the opportunity to speak directly to him. For many, it was the first time they had confronted the man who had haunted their lives for decades. The Golden State Killer case is particularly significant because of how investigators finally identified him. Traditional investigative methods had failed for decades, but advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy created a new path. Investigators did not simply match DeAngelo's DNA directly through a traditional criminal database. Instead, they used genetic information to identify relatives and reconstruct a family tree that ultimately led them to DeAngelo. The breakthrough demonstrated the extraordinary power of combining old evidence with new technology. Evidence collected decades earlier suddenly became useful again. A case that seemed impossible to solve finally had an answer. But the Golden State Killer case also revealed how long a serial offender could remain hidden. DeAngelo had lived an ordinary-looking life for decades. He had raised a family. He had worked. He had retired. And all the while, investigators were still searching for him. His crimes affected communities throughout California and left victims dealing with the consequences for decades. The official murder convictions totaled 13. But the full scale of his criminal activity was much larger because his guilty plea covered numerous additional offenses. That is why the Golden State Killer remains one of the most notorious serial offenders in California history. His identity remained a mystery for more than 40 years. Then, a combination of preserved evidence, forensic science, genealogy, and persistent investigative work finally exposed him. Joseph DeAngelo is now serving multiple life sentences in California State Prison. His arrest closed one of the longest-running criminal investigations in California history. But there is still one case left in our countdown. And unlike DeAngelo, the final killer became infamous not because he terrorized California neighborhoods for years, but because the number of confirmed victims connected to him made his case one of the darkest in the state's history. 1. Patrick Kearney, the trash bag killer. In Southern California during the 1970s, investigators began confronting a disturbing pattern. Young men were disappearing. Some of their remains were later discovered in different locations around Southern California, creating a difficult investigation involving multiple jurisdictions. The man eventually connected to the murders was Patrick Wayne Kearney. Kearney was born in East Los Angeles in 1939 and eventually settled in Southern California. He worked as an aerospace engineer and lived an outwardly ordinary life. But beginning in the 1960s, Kearney began committing murders. Investigators eventually determined that he had killed numerous young men and boys over a period of years. The case became known as the trash bag murders, because some victims' remains were discovered in discarded bags along roads and other locations. Kearney's victim count is complicated. He ultimately confessed to 28 murders, but he was convicted of 21. Investigators have suspected that the actual number could have been considerably higher, with estimates reaching into the 40s. Those higher figures remain suspected rather than proven. The victims included young men, teenagers, and at least 2 children. One of the youngest known victims was 5-year-old Ronald Dean Smith, Jr. Another was 8-year-old Merle Hondo Chance. The murders continued for years without Kearney being identified. Then, in 1977, investigators finally began connecting the cases. One victim in particular would become critical to solving the investigation. His name was John Otis LeMay, a 17-year-old who disappeared in March 1977. LeMay's disappearance eventually led investigators toward Kearney. Police began questioning Kearney and his partner, David Hill. As investigators continued examining the evidence, Kearney apparently realized that authorities were closing in. He and Hill fled. But their time as fugitives did not last long. On July 1, 1977, Kearney and Hill walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office and surrendered. The investigation that followed revealed the enormous scale of Kearney's crimes. Kearney began telling investigators about his victims. His statements helped authorities locate remains and reconstruct cases that had remained mysteries for years. He eventually confessed to 28 killings, but prosecutors could not necessarily prove every murder beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction became crucial. The final legal record established 21 murder convictions. Kearney pleaded guilty to those murders and received multiple life sentences. The case was extraordinary because investigators had gone from a collection of apparently unrelated disappearances to one offender responsible for a confirmed 21 murders. And Kearney's cooperation helped investigators identify victims and recover remains. But cooperation did not erase the enormity of what had happened. For the victims' families, every identification represented both an answer and a devastating confirmation. Some families had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Now they knew. The investigation also exposed the difficulties law enforcement faced when a serial killer operated across multiple communities. Different agencies could be investigating different disappearances without immediately realizing they were connected. Kearney's ability to travel throughout Southern California made the problem even more complicated. The case eventually became one of California's largest serial murder investigations. And although Kearney was convicted of 21 murders, the investigation never completely established the full number of people he may have killed. His confession to 28 murders was already higher than his conviction total. Investigators' suspicions went higher still. But responsible reporting requires separating confirmed victims, confessions, and suspected victims, rather than presenting every allegation as fact. Patrick Kearney remains imprisoned in California. His case stands as one of the state's most notorious serial murder investigations, not because of a mysterious identity like the Zodiac Killer, but because investigators eventually uncovered an enormous number of victims connected to one offender. 21 murders were proven in court. 28 were confessed to, and investigators believed there could have been more. The case remains a grim reminder of how difficult it can be to recognize a serial killing pattern when victims disappear across different communities and jurisdictions. It also demonstrates how crucial cooperation between investigators can become when separate cases begin forming a larger pattern. Patrick Kearney's crimes ended in 1977, but the investigation continued to uncover answers long afterward, and by the time the case was fully understood, California had witnessed one of the largest confirmed serial murder cases in its history. From Efrain Saldivar to Patrick Kearney, these cases revealed some of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. Some killers were identified quickly, while others remained hidden for decades. Advances in DNA technology eventually helped solve cold cases, while other mysteries, like the Zodiac Killer, remain unsolved. The confirmed victim counts varied dramatically, but every case left behind families and communities searching for answers. If you found this investigation interesting, subscribe to the channel for more true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and dark stories from history. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation.